Welcome to Nightmares and Grief, a place to explore and celebrate the darkness. Today's episode is part 9 of my novel, To Make the World Obey. Previously, Deborah charged the firing line barehanded by Freddy and Hardigan Time. Temujin's men took her. She woke up in a cage in the clan's basement, surrounded by captive women held like animals. They called this process Fajan, the breaking. While Deborah was underground, Johnny walked into the hospital unopposed. The police were too busy saving themselves from Temujin's raid to notice a convoy of gangsters wheeling Bartu out the front door. In an abandoned warehouse, Johnny and the silent enforcer Lucardo went to work with pliers, a Louisville Slugger, a knife, and a box of salt. Bartu broke. He gave up the address, 3918 Pine Street. Freddy gave up something too. Wartime Freddy surfaced in the aftermath of the station attack, executing wounded raiders until one of them talked and gave up the same address. Now 2 crews are headed for Pine Street. Deborah is locked in the basement waiting for them, and Temujin has just shown everyone what he does to those who defy him. How does it end? Find out on To Make the World Obey. Now, settle in, check under the bed, and pour a drink for the skeletons in your closet. It's time to start. Johnny, December 16th, 2024. The sun was just rising when Johnny wiped the blood off his hands with a stiff, oil-stained rag. He sucked on the cigarette protruding from his lips, closed his eyes, and paid attention to the sensations. The abrasive rag scratched his palms and the back of his hands. The cigarette smoke tugged on his throat. The drifting tendrils clawed at his nostrils. His brain went a little light with the nicotine. It had been a long night. Johnny opened his eyes. Birds chortled outside the warehouse. The chilly morning air was refreshing. What a fucking night. What a fucking night. With their shirts partially unbuttoned, the others nodded in shared sentiment. Cosmo rubbed his forehead with his fingertips, the cigarette pinched between his middle and index finger. He brought the silver flask to his lips and took a long draw with both eyes shut and peaceful. He screwed the lid back on and dropped the flask back into his pocket. What a fucking night. Lucardo seemed unaffected by the violence. He appeared merely tired. He declined Johnny's offer for a cigarette. He sat on the backwards-facing folding chair, leaning against it, and rubbed the dark 4 o'clock shadow that had colored his jaw over the course of the night. On the stolen hospital gurney before him lay Bartu's open corpse. From collarbone to pelvis, they'd sliced through the flesh. All his organs were removed. His ribcage pulled apart. Above the scarlet brutality, his limp neck seemed unable to support the weight of his head anymore, as if the mask of horror had doubled the load. The shallow eye sockets had been hollowed into black portals rimmed with ragged, uneven lines of sticky, blackened blood. Along his back, Johnny had scrawled a huge, succinct note with a knife. Fuck you. The whole job had been particularly gruesome. Mr. Greaves had wanted to send a message, and this was probably enough. Johnny killed his cigarette beneath the heel of his shoe and twisted. He took the soft pack out of the breast pocket of his shirt and tapped out another Winston against his wrist. Cosmo reached out and touched Johnny's shoulder. When Johnny looked, Cosmo patted him on the back and tapped his lips with 2 fingers. Johnny gave him an unlit cigarette, lit it for Cosmo, and then got his own. The 2 men smoked in silence for a while, listening to the birds outside. "What do you want to do with him?" Johnny took a drag before answering. "We gotta put him somewhere. It's gotta be someplace he's gonna be found, but I'd rather the freaks find him instead of the cops." "Makes sense," Cosmo nodded. Johnny cast a look at Lucardo and asked, "You got any ideas, big guy?" Lucardo stared at him grimly. "Yeah." Johnny pulled on his cigarette. "Didn't think so." They finished their smokes and Cosmo finished his flask. They still had a lot of work ahead of them. The body was placed in a big black body bag. They wiped down the hospital bed and the lights, collapsed the folding chairs, and stacked them up to the side. Johnny cussed about the bloodstains. "Shoulda put down fucking newspaper." "Or a drop cloth," Cosmo suggested. "Fucking something," Johnny finished. It took about an hour to pack everything they needed to keep and to decide what to do with the junk they didn't want. They didn't attempt to clean the stain. Part of Johnny wanted the cops to bust the warehouse and find it, point the finger at him as he dared them to do something about it. With the way things were going, he practically considered killing the son of a bitch as a public service. Between his amateur detective work and cleaning up the streets, he was becoming a regular fucking Batman. Johnny smiled. What a fucking world. Lucardo left to go home before they finished. Cleaning up wasn't part of his job, and nobody expected it to be. He looked about ready to collapse anyway. "Poor guy looks tired," Cosmo murmured as Lucardo left the warehouse. "Hope he gets home okay. You know, they say driving tired is more dangerous than driving drunk." "Yeah, I heard that before." Cosmo sighed and stretched with a groan. They surveyed the warehouse, checking for final sundries. Cosmo pointed. "Holy shit!" He jerked his chin at Dr. Murphy, who lay unconscious on the floor beside the body bag. "What do you want to do with him?" Johnny scratched the back of his head, groaning. "Fuck, I forgot about that asshole." He grimaced and stomped his foot while snapping his fingers. "Man, I totally fucking forgot about him." Cosmo nodded. "Me too." "He turned out to be pretty fucking useless." "Yeah," Cosmo shrugged. "But don't beat yourself up, kid. It was a good idea." "Well, I guess he's seen too much." "In more ways than one." Johnny strode over to the doctor and shot him in the head. "You think we can leave him here?" "Someone's gonna find him." "Yeah." Johnny sucked on his cheek. "I guess we ought to take him with us. Dump him in the river or some shit." "Just put him in a dumpster," Cosmo suggested. He pulled his coat around him tighter, hugging himself. "It always works for me." "There's that Methodist church on the way back to town. Nobody's ever there during the week. We can drop him off in their dumpster." Cosmo pointed at Johnny and nodded with a grin. "That's using your head, kid." They packed the body bag in the trunk and stacked the dead doctor on top of it, wrapping his head in an undershirt so he wouldn't bleed all over the place.
They listened to a morning radio show on their way out, where the hosts prank called an old folks' home. When they got to the Methodist church, Johnny drove catty corner across the deserted lot and stopped by the rusted blue dumpster near the back. He left the car running as Cosmo helped him toss the dead doctor in. The prank calls ended, and none of them had been very good. The show ended and was replaced by local news. Cosmo complained about his joints, but something the news anchors said caught Johnny's attention, and he snapped at the old man to be quiet. "Shut the fuck up!" he snarled, cranking up the volume against Cosmo's protests. "Shut the fuck up about your goddamn knees. What's he saying?"
The city is still reeling over last night's attack on the local police headquarters. One witness's description of the scene was eerily similar to that of the Fred Meyer massacre a few weeks ago. The next voice was vaguely familiar to Johnny. He knew he'd heard it before and placed it at Cosmo's club, but he couldn't put a face on it. The image of a basset hound came to mind. It was terrible. They came in like a hurricane. There were a bunch of them, like maybe 9 or 10, and they all had assault rifles. They were wearing weird armor. They shot the place up and killed a lot of people. There wasn't much we could do. They just came in and blew through the place. What did they want? They were looking for something. I think it was a person.
Separate from the interview, the anchorman continued with the story.
Authorities confirmed that the suspect was held in custody in relation to the Fred Meyer massacre. However, he had been hospitalized earlier that day due to an incident that took place while the man was held for questioning. One source says that the police suspect the attack on their facility last night was done in retaliation.
Johnny shook his head in amazement. Cosmo said, "Of all the fucking luck!" He turned the volume back down. "I guess that explains why it was so easy to nab the prick." "You ever hear about synchronicities?" Johnny asked. "The fuck is that?" It's like a coincidence, like a cosmic coincidence. "What about it?" They say when shit lines up like this, it means you're on the right path, like it was meant to be. You think that's what happened in here? "I don't fucking know, kid. It's your fucking idea. You tell me." Johnny watched the road with faraway eyes. He silently pondered the possibility. Then, the reporter said something else that caught his attention. He swatted the air for Cosmo to be quiet, then turned up the volume.
Police also confirm that, though the raiders failed to find the suspect in question, they have instead taken a hostage, one female detective whose identity remains a secret.
A lump formed in Johnny's throat. A stone fell into his gut. No, he thought, she wouldn't be that fucking dumb. Another voice, this one also familiar, emerged to elaborate on the development.
The kidnapped detective was on leave. This is true. She came to the station on an unrelated matter and got caught in the fighting. Things would have been a lot worse if she hadn't been there. It has become this department's #1 priority to rescue the detective and hold the ones responsible accountable to the fullest extent of the law. His voice went low and grave. It carried the stern severity of a threat. If those men are listening now, I have only this to say. Surrender the detective. Do not harm her. Johnny's gut twisted in knots, and now he was certain of his fears. Deborah had been taken. He caught Cosmo studying him with a look of confusion and concern. "What? What's your fucking damage? Take a fucking picture or something, old man." "You got a face like you just heard your dog got the shit kicked out of it." Cosmo still eyed him. When Johnny didn't respond, he flicked his chin and asked, "What's up, kid? What do you know? What do you say?" "Nothing, Cos.
I'm just thinking maybe we could cut a deal or something. What are you thinking? Cosmo glanced at him with sidelong, cautious interest. Johnny shrugged. You know, we're looking for the same guys, right? We? Us and the cops, Johnny clarified, gesticulating with fingers on the wheel. We're both looking for those psychos, and they're not getting anywhere. Now, we've got the info that they don't. Maybe we can cut a deal to... Cosmo shook his head and waved his hand through the air like he was trying to fan away a foul odor. No. I'm going to stop you right there, kid. We're not doing any of that. Well, why the flying fuck not, Cos? Everything we just did would be a complete fucking waste, Johnny. Use your fucking head for once and think about it. Johnny feigned resignation and nodded. I guess you're right, Kaz. In truth, he was just glad that satisfied the old man. He had no interest in conspiring with the police. The law would only get in his way. But he would kill two birds with one stone. He could finish his job for Mr. Greaves and rescue Deborah in the same stroke. The latter goal, however, would complicate the former. He wouldn't be able to bring any backup with him. He was on his own. It'd be his pistol and himself with no one else. Just the way he was used to. Fuck it, he thought. May as well try.
Deborah, December 16th, 2024. Tension hung in the basement air like ozone after a rainstorm. Hushed chatter vibrated against the dark, dull walls, and Deborah knew she was the topic of discussion. All around her she saw strength, but all around her was unwillingness. There was fear. Deborah did not understand these women. In the weak, wan light filtering through the open door at the top of the stairs, Deborah inspected her cage. It was flimsy, bolted shut with a heavy chain, but the bars were thin. They were hardly even bars, more like sturdy wire like those of dog kennels. Deborah wouldn't have been surprised if that was precisely what they were. She imagined the men would have found it appropriate. In any case, she knew that with enough time and determination, she could bend the bars into a hole big enough for her to slip through. The matter was not so much getting out of the cage. Deborah had never assumed that to be the problem, but rather how to get out of the building. For that, she hoped to gain an ally. Deevy's eyes held in them something dark, sharp, and feral. It gave Deborah a little in the way of hope. Not much, but still some, and hope was precious currency in the basement. The women hoarded it jealously in whatever way they could, with whatever strength they could muster. Some hope was better than none. Only the dead can truly have no hope at all. Deevy's back faced Deborah, the bars of the cage striping the blood-soaked bandages that had laid across her skin. The range of her vertebra pressing against the cloth was so pronounced that it could be climbed like stairs. Deborah wondered what had happened to her in this place. She knew, or rather she thought she knew, who Deevy was in silhouette before she had been taken. Who was she now? Who had she become? What had she become?
As if aware of the detective's gaze, DV's back shifted. The young woman changed position, moving forward to kneel, pressing her palms into the cage's plastic floor. The girl's fury had turned like spoiled fruit, curdled into something dangerous and wholly uncivilized. DV kept in her eyes the look of a woman whom others had tried to break and could not. Her spirit bore dents and scratches and more than a few gashes, but it resisted. Her lips curled back, baring her teeth. "What do you want?" she snarled at Deborah. "I want to get out of here," was Deborah's gentle reply. DV grinned and shook her head like it was a joke. "We all want things," she growled. "Do you want it too?" DV raised an eyebrow. She looked at Deborah sidelong and said nothing. Deborah pressed. "I think we could get out together." "What makes you think that?" Deborah gestured to the thoroughfare between the rows of cages. "Didn't you see what I did out there? I saw you lose. I was alone. Imagine what I could do with a friend." "Yeah, and when I tried that, look at what it got me. Fresh stripes on my back." DV shifted again, turning around to fully face Deborah cross-legged with her hands on her knees and her angular elbows pointing outward. Even though she was a little smaller than the height of the cage while sitting, her back still curved in a dramatic arc from her pelvis. But there was a little glimmer of light in the darkest part of her eyes. A tiny, cold, cynical fleck of glitter. DV raised her bony hands and gestured all around her. "Take a look," she beckoned. "Look at us. Tell me you see rebellion is just stewing in this hot pot." Deborah looked, but she tried not to see. Desperation hung in the air like a wet, musty odor of lichen. It was the desperation of defeat. These were women who had nothing to lose but themselves, and they clung so viciously to that scrap that they would never risk it. Deborah had been certain her assault would inspire them to rise up with her and overthrow the men keeping them down, but she saw now they were past that hope. Indeed, hope was so precious in this place because they had so little. These women now could only hope that they could not lose their lives. But themselves. She had to show them that they could still lose their lives as long as they did not lose themselves. DV cocked an eyebrow again and ran her tongue over her teeth. "You're scheming. I can tell." Deborah's gaze landed back upon DV, and the girl shuddered at its touch. The soldier raised her chin. "Why aren't you?" It was as if she didn't want to get out. The guarded cynicism she had nestled into like stone walls protected her like Deborah's fortresses. But they also prevented her from opening her heart to the possibility of escape. Escape simply couldn't happen, reasoned DV's cynicism. It had already abandoned the dreams of pancakes on lazy Sunday mornings, or the crunch of snow, or the chirp of birds beside a lake. The hope in the basement was so broken that these women had forgotten about their families, friends, and any lingering desire to get married or have their own children. Deborah understood what they experienced. It wasn't the first time she'd ever seen it. It made her sad to see it again. She decided to lead by example. Deborah awoke to the creaking of the stairs against heavy footsteps. One of the raiders came downstairs to feed the women. Each man carried a bucket of hot oatmeal. Each woman was given a ladle full of pale gray oatmeal served in a styrofoam bowl. They were not given a utensil. He didn't seem particularly focused. His dull eyes wandered over the landscape of the women, clearly lost in fantasy. It was not lost on Deborah. The raider came closer to her, stopping to spoon out gruel before opening the cage to toss the bowl inside. Deborah thought fast, the calculating wartime arithmetic of cost, benefit, and risk. The plan was stupid. It failed the calculations, but it was worth a shot if it meant the others might follow suit. If a single act of rebellion was not enough to show them the way, then perhaps they only needed one more. Outside of her cage, at the level of the door, the raider's legs eclipsed the face of the woman across from Deborah. Deborah studied his movements as he raised his ladle from the oatmeal-encrusted bucket and sloughed the gruel into the bowl with a thick slap. Her muscles tensed, and a prickly wave rustled across her skin as goosebumps erupted like toadstools. Her cage door creaked open. It was louder than the night before, wasn't it? And as soon as it was wide enough, Deborah launched herself through, aiming for the man's legs. She collided with his knees, and though he was big, Deborah had tackled him with enough force to make him cry out as his knees bent unnaturally. He stumbled backwards while she crawled her way up him, the lines of her face twisted into something gruesome, vicious, and bloodthirsty. For a few moments, Deborah seemed to register the man's expression, registering fear mixed with a tremendous surprise. Once she raked her nails across his face and wrapped her hands around his throat, however, it was difficult to read anything at all in the lines of his expression. There was too much blood. He tried to throw her off, but Deborah pressed hard enough on the pressure points of his throat that he faded slowly away. The man stopped moving. His face changed color, and Deborah didn't stop squeezing. She willed even more strength into her hands and squeezed even tighter. She did not let go until his pulse no longer pressed against her fingers. Deborah snatched up the keys. "DV," she said, sifting through the keys, "I'm going to need your help if I'm going to get out of here alive." DV didn't say anything. She studied the scene before her with wide, white eyes. They were a little frightened and a little apprehensive, but deep inside, the hot coals had been stoked into a blaze. Deborah knelt beside her and unlocked the cage door, her hand extended. "Are you with me?" All around them, the basement erupted into pure chaos. Women begged for Deborah's attention, some screaming, some weeping, some shaking their cages' bars. The basement's energy had changed entirely. Where once was cold, flaccid despair, now electric hope crackled like a ball of lightning. Where once there had been quiet desperation, now was such a din that Deborah was certain they would be discovered, and that Temujin and his ilk would come and put them back in their cages with the brutal force to which they had become accustomed. They needed to move quickly. DV looked at the hand, and then looked at Deborah. She swallowed and then nodded. "My name's Dizzy. Dizzy Vicious." She took Deborah's hand.
Temujin, December 16th, 2024.
There was so much noise in the basement that the women did not hear the raiders' own chaos erupting upstairs. They were too focused on their own madness to be aware of the madness surrounding them. Temujin awoke in the darkness, as he always did. When he swung his bare feet out of the bed and onto the floor, the awareness of its frigidity shocked him. Temujin embraced the cold as it jolted sleep from his eyes. He was awake, and something was wrong. One of the lessons Temujin learned once he had abandoned his boxed life was that intuition carried greater wisdom than he could ever hold in his conscious thought. There was so much in the world, and the conscious mind was so slow. Intuition is the product of a faster kind of processing, the subconscious emulsification of all sensory knowledge happening faster than the mind can form coherent thought. He breathed in the cold air, allowing it to crackle electric in his lungs. Sounds erupted downstairs. Temujin burst out of the warehouse office, a rallying cry tearing from his throat and a pistol gripped tightly in his fist. The stairs thundered as he ran down them. Others burst out behind him as they awoke, all in various stages of dress. Some had bothered to put on pants, while others were still in sleeping clothes, and still more, like Temujin, emerged naked. All of them were armed. All of them were screaming. The gunshots started from the kitchen. Their aim was true. Temujin spun around to see three of his men collapse, either from fatal or would-be fatal wounds. Only a glimpse of the shooter could be caught. A dark jacket, dark pants, before he was gone. Temujin pushed over the kitchen table to use as a barricade. More bullets shouted violent obscenities. Some of them punched holes in the table, sending flakes of wood dust and ill will streaming past Temujin's face. The feeling began in his gut, building slowly and unnoticed until it had consumed every strand of his muscles and tainted every ounce of his blood. It was hot, so hot that he was almost certain the acid in his stomach boiled. A haze sheathed his vision like red mist, and he swore that the air dampened and made it more difficult to breathe. Rage, such as this, Temujin was certain, had never once been seen in the history of mankind. It was so deep, so primal, that he could almost pinpoint its point of origin in his brain, coiled so deep in the gray matter that it tapped into emotions of ancient scaly ancestry. The rage was not a part of him. It defined him, serving as the bedrock of his essence and the kernel of his entire being. All around him, the clatter and disaster of the ensuing gunfight faded away to silence, replaced in Temujin's ear only by a faint, high-pitched ring. At last, Temujin thought, I have killed all those ridiculous parts of me. He emerged from behind the table with a droll, almost disgusted expression, as if the adrenaline coursing through his veins by means of his hateful heart had short-circuited his mind, frying his ability to process. Across from him, Johnny poked around a corner and fired a few shots towards Temujin, believing in earnest he had the man cornered, but completely unaware of the mental transformation. Temujin had broken himself. All the human pieces which had once made Trevor Montgomery, Big Five store manager, Planet Fitness member, drinker of cheap gas station tall boys, and sometimes cyclist, they were cinders in the wake of his rage. Temujin destroyed all the parts that Johnny or any other person might recognize. Only hate remained. Temujin launched himself over the barricade with his pistol in hand, and though Johnny opened fire, it seemed as if Temujin bent around the bullets, or that the bullets moved around him. The raider raised his gun and fired back, still advancing toward his quarry. Every step was the forced march of a jackhammer, powerful, steady, and unyielding. Johnny swore as a mild sense of panic blossomed like a red tulip. He yielded to it, falling back and firing still, shooting and shooting until the gun clicked empty. He walked backwards, reloading the gun, keeping pace with Temujin until he stumbled. Johnny slipped. The back of his head cracked against the kitchen counter. Bright, swirling constellations spun before his eyes, but through the veil emerged Temujin, closing the gap between them. Johnny swallowed. There were so many things he had come to regret. He tried to reload the pistol, gritting his teeth to muscle through the fog, but the clip slipped out of his shaky hands and clattered to the ground. He took a deep breath and searched the blurry figure before him for a face so that he might stare death in the eyes. There was a scream. Johnny thought it was his own. But he was in no condition to make a sound so bold. The sound of his own voice would have been braided with panic rather than the challenge sealed in what he heard. The figure halted, the edges of Johnny's vision refocused. He saw two women leap onto Temujin. Johnny smiled. "Hey, sugar," he murmured. From the front door came a loud bang and the crackle of splintering wood. Furious commands followed. There was more gunfire, but before Johnny could locate its origin, pain filled his senses, blooming first from his chest and then somewhere along his leg, and the vision which he had only just regained faded out into darkness. Freddy, December 16th, 2024. Freddy was full of rage, too. It was he who kicked open the door to the warehouse on Pine Street. He never thought he had the strength to kick a door down, and he hadn't planned to do it, but he did. He wielded the gun with a soldier's precision that felt like an old, familiar friend, moving with grace as he swept the gun and his body through the building. He encountered little resistance, and what he did was gun down without hesitation. When they reached the warehouse, Freddy no longer controlled his faculties. He no longer sensed the gun as if it were an entity separate from himself. He and death were one and the same. 3 men crumpled to the ground. Freddy hadn't registered their faces when he fired. Hardigan shadowed Freddy, functioning little more than that. While Freddy led them into the warehouse, Hardigan faltered. He hesitated before firing. He looked around the corners too much. He had not yet acquired Freddy's madness. But when they reached the kitchen, he acted on his own. Freddy fired his gun, and Hardigan knew he couldn't stop the man, but he still cried,
"Police! Freeze! All of you down on the ground!"
It was less about the command and more about what the command stood for. It seemed important that he say it, even if it was not obeyed nor even acknowledged. Freddy shot 3 more of the sons of bitches. Temujin ripped his arm from Deborah's grasp and used it to throw Dizzy through the air and into one of the upper cabinets. The wood splintered and buckled. Dizzy's body made a soft thud when she hit the floor. Deborah lunged again, digging her fingers into Temujin's neck and holding on despite the enormous man's flailing. He groped around his body for her, but he couldn't get a hold of her. When he heard Hardigan's bark, he whirled around, raised his pistol, and fired upon the police. Most of the shots missed. Some of them did not. Red spray spurted from Freddy's shoulder, then his arm. The shock tore through Deborah, gutting her as acutely as a blade. She spasmed and lost her grip on her quarry. She fell to the ground. Firing a few more shots, Temujin whirled around and lifted Deborah by the hair. He cracked her with the butt of the pistol. She resisted, but the blow made her sluggish. Temujin carried her effortlessly, his arm wrapped around her from behind, holding her before him like a shield, his pistol pressed to her head. Hardigan and Freddy stopped firing. Deborah was at his mercy. He was going to get away. Freddy roared a string of obscenities. Hardigan sucked on his tongue and studied the scene for options. He found none by the time Temujin exited the room. All around them were the bodies of men. The cult was broken, albeit at great cost. The room stank of blood and hot gunmetal. Freddy kicked a cabinet and screamed nonsense. Hardigan holstered his gun and bent to pick up one of the cultists' assault rifles. "What are you doing?" Freddy asked, clutching his arm. Hardigan checked the magazine and then pulled the slide back on the AR.
"What? You were going to give up?" Deborah, December 16th, 2024. The world swirled around Deborah like an Edvard Munch painting. The lights lining the street waggled long tails, bleeding languidly into the early winter darkness. The color of buildings seemed uncertain, and she couldn't tell if it was because she had forgotten the word for them, or if they flickered and bled into one another. Most notable was the cold. Deborah didn't think she'd ever been so cold in her whole life. Even just looking at the darkness made her shiver. It was as if the night had chased away all vestiges of warmth along with the light. Strength returned to her, bit by bit. Her senses grew sharper, just a little. Her thoughts grew clearer, just a little, until by inches she regained her mind and body. Deborah feigned
unconsciousness, trying to figure out where Temujin was taking her. Although she had her wits about her again, she was not confident she could take him in a head-on fight. That much was evident from their previous encounters. Whatever Deborah might think of herself, she was not as strong as him, not physically. She would have to bide her time and find the right opportunity to strike. She wondered where everyone was. She thought about Freddy and worried about him. She worried about Hardigan. She was touched that Johnny had come. It was remarkably stupid of him, but it was sweet. Regardless of his mistakes, Johnny was a good man. Deborah hoped she'd have the chance to tell him. They hadn't been driving long before the rows of lights bordering the road thinned. Darkness overtook the car despite Twilight's best efforts. Where was he taking her? Why were they leaving the city? He had to know he'd be caught. That bothered Deborah. If he knew what was in store for him, then he was preparing something drastic. The sun sank below the horizon, and he'd already left the city and come back. He was trying to determine if he had a tail. And apparently satisfied that he did not, Temujin returned to the city to make his final move. Deborah armed the soldiers in her mental fortress. She steeled herself for whatever was about to come. He'd killed enough time that the squat businesses were well illuminated by the yellow lights of street lamps. She knew this place. The mall. Deborah pictured another massacre. The kind of wholesale slaughter that would make the Fred Meyer incident look like an opening act. She smelled gasoline. Red tanks lay at her feet. Maniac had to be stopped. While Deborah ran through her options, Temujin floored the gas pedal. The sudden acceleration bolted Deborah upright, and she called out in surprise before she could contain herself. The van launched over the curb. People scattered, and people screamed. The van ran straight through the glass doors and into the food court of the mall. Not everyone in front of the vehicle was able to escape. The rumble of breaking bodies beneath the tires punctuated a good 20 feet. Temujin pulled down hard on the steering wheel, and the car slid into the congregation of tables and bystanders. Once they'd come to a halt, Deborah flung open the door and scampered out. "Run! Run! He's got a gun!" Others echoed her warning and her command, fleeing the scene as fast as they could. Temujin hauled himself out of the van.
"Detective, I advise you to stay where you are. Don't run! You'll make it worse."
He shouldered the AR and fired into the ceiling before aiming it into the escaping crowd. Some of them collapsed. There were screams. Temujin withdrew the red gas tanks, then pointed the gun at Deborah.
"I'm warning you not to take another step, Detective."
She leaped over the counter of a Panda Express and ducked down just as Temujin opened fire. Ceramic rained down on her from above. Sparks flew as he shot up the electric menu. Keeping low, Deborah scurried into the kitchen looking for anything she could use either to escape or, preferably, to fight. She despised this running away, and someone had to stop Temujin before he could deliver his final message.
"Woman, come out now!"
Temujin fired another lantern fistful of bullets. Under her breath, Deborah snarled to herself, "Fuck me sideways." She wasn't finding anything she wanted, but the chances of finding a derringer beneath the grill were unlikely. She took a long breath and closed her eyes. There was only one thing she could use that could do any real damage here. Deborah grabbed 2 large chef's knives. Between them, she had a prayer. Outside of the restaurant, Temujin monologued.
I have set something into motion. My work is a movement. I am immortal, woman. Do you hear me? I have transcended the realm of flesh and blood and have become a legend. People will say my name for centuries to come.
The Panda Express connected to the Sbarro by means of a red metal door. While Temujin screamed, Deborah prayed it wouldn't creak when she opened it. She snuck through and pulled the door shut with silent care, knives still in hand, and keeping as low as possible. She took a quick survey of the Sbarro kitchen in case there was anything more useful than the blades. There was nothing. She crept to the counter. Gasoline tang filled the air.
You think this is about you?
Temujin roared over splashing sounds.
This is bigger than you could ever imagine. You're just a brick in the wall, detective. You're nothing. If I take a few steps back, you blend in with the rest of them.
Deborah stood a chance. She peered over the counter. Temujin splashed gasoline over the escalator beside the van. He spattered it across the entrance to the JCPenney. His gun was slung over his shoulder. She took a deep breath. It was as good a chance as she'd ever get. Deborah launched herself over the counter. She'd never sprinted so fast in her life. She closed the space between the JCPenney and her hiding spot in a matter of seconds. Temujin grinned and lit a match. An ocean of fire erupted around him. It sprang up the clothing racks, bathing the store with orange light. The heat was sudden and intense. The ceiling sprinklers erupted, showering impotent rain that vaporized into hot steam. The gas burned too hot. All around them was fire. Dancing, cackling yellow flames swallowed gaps, fortifying their walls, trapping Temujin and Deborah alike.
You've got nowhere to run!
Screamed Temujin. His tendons lined his neck and veins webbed his naked scalp. Neither do you, Deborah spat back. Temujin shrugged the gun off his shoulder. Deborah laughed at him. You need that big gun to kill a little girl like me? Temujin hesitated, looking at the rifle and then back to Deborah. He raised his head high on his shoulders, tightening his jaw like a clenched fist. He tossed the rifle aside. Fire surrounded Deborah on all sides. He made his way toward her, shoulders square, eyes set, a small smile on his lips. From above, a support beam fell, nearly colliding with him. It blocked his path with another fiery wall. But Temujin didn't flinch. He tensed before springing through the fire, landing on the other side of the beam. The small smile blossomed into a full-blown grin. He'd never been happier in his life. He circled her like a panther, and she turned along with his orbit, brandishing her knives, her face twisted by her own war mask. Temujin kept his eyes locked with hers as he paced. He thought about the stories they'd tell of him, how the great Temujin made his mark on the boxes of society and took down one of its champions. Martyred, his life would mean something. In death, he would realize his purpose. Perhaps his glorious fantasies played out on his face, because Deborah said, "Fuck that." It was enough to put off Temujin. He stopped and gave her a strange look. The smile stayed on his lips, but it wavered, if only slightly. But then, rising from within him, came the seizure. He could feel it. Like rotten memory, the stink of a nauseous brain, and the smile dropped from his face. He fell out of the world. It went black. Deborah snatched the opening. The first knife flew from her hand, slicing through the air. Temujin gaped blankly at nothing, his mouth smacking open and closed like he was chewing gum. The knife sank into his chest. Everything fell into place as if in slow motion, like there was a lag between the event happening and the reality catching up. Deborah lunged. Her legs tensed and she screamed and she flew through the air, the other knife raised high as if she were a priestess in a roaming clan of ancient barbarians. The blade plunged into him once, twice, thrice. Deborah lost count, had never really counted to begin with, and she didn't stop. Temujin's hot, sticky blood painted his chest, speckling his shocked expression of abject horror. Deborah screamed and wailed, and it bothered her a little. Later, it would bother her a lot that Temujin didn't once make a single sound. The crackling fire and the sloppy, wet, sucking sound of the blade accompanied the song of Deborah's screams. Temujin sank to his knees. Deborah didn't stop. The force of her assault pushed him onto his back, and Deborah didn't stop. She had no idea that a human being could have so much blood. The light in Temujin's eyes had flickered out, and Deborah realized that she hadn't noticed precisely when. Had it just happened? Had it happened 30 seconds ago? 5 minutes? How long had she been carried by the violence? Her arms were tired. Much of the skin and muscle comprising Temujin's chest was a pulverized, stringy red mess. Deborah stopped. Her shoulders heaved with a shaky, irregular gait. She looked around and saw that the empty circle inside the fire had shrunk. Peering through the orange curtain into the greater space of the pennies, she took a deep breath and sucked on her tongue. Temujin could jump through the flames. Couldn't she? Deborah pulled back her hair and tied it into a knot. She took a few quick, deep breaths and then ran, launching herself into the flames. She emerged on the other side, singed, a little burned and shaken, but she was alive. That was a better place than she'd anticipated she'd be an hour ago. Bodies strewn about the abandoned mall, soaking in puddles of blood. Behind her burned the corpse of Temujin. Although her rational mind screamed at her to leave, to escape the threat of fire as quickly as she could, Deborah felt the tightness of drying blood along her arms and face, and chose to find a sink. she found herself immersed in the most bizarre calm she had ever experienced. She thought about it as she wiped herself down and filled the sink with red. It was a panicked tranquility, a mandatory serenity. When at last she emerged from the bathroom, she heard voices and the hiss of steam. Firefighters had come and sprayed water onto the raging fire. Approaching her were two figures in police uniforms. They had their guns drawn, but once they were close enough to recognize who she was, they lowered them. "Detective Sampson?" one of them asked. "Yeah, that's me."
Epilogue, December 25th, 2024.
The dying cat's squeal of the door hadn't been heard in days. Since Adam and Shaylee came back, Deborah hadn't left the apartment. The warm amber glow of Christmas tree lights illuminated the apartment. Foil wrapping paper scattered on the floor and coffee table winked back their reflection. Deborah tucked her legs beneath her on the couch and balanced a bowl of popcorn between herself and Shaylee. The little girl sat cross-legged, her attention fixed on the television screen where two cartoon dogs shared a plate of spaghetti by candlelight. "This is the best part," Shaylee whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the moment. Deborah watched as Lady and the Tramp met in the middle of a single noodle, their first kiss sealed by marinara and moonlight. The music swelled. Shaylee sighed with satisfaction. Deborah's mind drifted to another conversation about food, about strength, about what it meant to be starving for something the world wouldn't feed. You find those cocksuckers and you kill them. The words had felt like salvation. Now they tasted like ash. "Auntie Deb?" Shaylee's voice pulled her back. "Are you crying?" Deborah touched her cheek, surprised to find it damp. "No, baby girl. Just thinking about how nice this is." Shaylee smiled and leaned against her aunt's shoulder. "Pop-Pop was right. You do love spaghetti." Deborah stroked Shaylee's hair, focusing on the weight of the small body against her side, the rise and fall of her breath. This was what mattered. This was what she had fought to protect. The apartment was quiet, except for the television and Adam's gentle snoring from his recliner, where he'd fallen asleep with the remote in his lap. When the credits began to roll, Shaylee had curled into Deborah's lap like a cat, her eyelids heavy. Deborah carried her into the bedroom, pulling the covers up to her chin and kissing her forehead. "Merry Christmas, baby girl." "Merry Christmas, Auntie. Thank you for watching the movie with me." "Of course, baby girl. I love you." Back in the living room, Deborah began gathering the remnants of their celebration. Empty gift boxes, crumpled wrapping paper, ribbon that had been carefully saved and would likely never be used again. She felt like she watched herself as she might a coin at the bottom of a fountain, the image displaced by gentle ripples. 9 days ago, she had been locked in a cage like an animal. 9 days ago, she had stabbed a man to death in a burning department store. Now, she was cleaning up after Christmas morning like everyone else in the city. She stuffed everything into a large garbage bag, tiptoeing so as not to wake Adam. At the door, she slipped on her shoes and coat, then stepped into the hallway. The humming fluorescent bulbs overhead cast a jaundiced yellow light, encroached upon by faint shadows. Her footsteps echoed as she walked to the garbage chute at the end of the hall. Johnny emerged from the stairs below when she reached the landing above the chute. He was thinner than she remembered, and he favored his left side slightly. He didn't smile at her. Instead, he simply nodded. "Merry Christmas," he said, his words soft and uncertain. "Merry Christmas." They shared the space in the moment as two people who had seen each other's darkness and somehow emerged alive. "You okay?" "Been better. You?" "Same." Deborah opened the chute door and dropped her bag of bright Christmas paper into the darkness. The sound it made when it hit the bottom sounded like a small gunshot. "Thanks for what you did." "Thanks for coming." He studied her face in the ugly light. "You know, this doesn't change anything, right? Between what you are and I am." "I know." Deborah met his eyes. "Next time I see you, it'll probably be with a warrant and handcuffs." Johnny's mouth quirked upward, just slightly. "Don't tempt me with a good time." Without another word, Deborah turned and ascended the stairs. And judging by the echoed footsteps in the opposite direction, so did Johnny. The dying cat's squeal of the door whined as Deborah went inside. She slapped the deadbolt closed and slid the chain lock into place. She checked them twice. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it. Adam still asleep in his chair, Shaylee safe in her bed, the Christmas tree lights casting their gentle glow. Everything was as it should be. Everything was perfect. So why did she feel so hollow? Deborah moved to the living room window and looked out at the city. Snow fell in lazy spirals through the streetlights, covering the sidewalks in pristine white. Somewhere out there, people were sleeping peacefully in their beds, trusting that morning would come and that the darkness would retreat with the dawn. She used to believe that too. She used to think that light and darkness were separate things, that you could choose one or the other, that good people stayed in the light and bad people lurked in the shadows, but she knew better now. Deborah pressed her palm against the window, watching her reflection merge with the darkness beyond the glass. In the distance, a siren wailed. Someone else's emergency. Someone else's nightmare beginning. The world was full of nightmares and dreams. She had spent her life trying to stand between them, believing in a thin blue line that separated order from chaos. But there was no line. There were only those strong enough to make the world obey, and those too weak to resist. Everything else was just pretty lies people told themselves to sleep at night. Outside, the snow fell heavier. It was such a pretty, pure white, but tomorrow it would be gray with exhaust and trampled into slush. Deborah sighed. Her breath fogged the reflection in the glass. She had everything she'd fought for. Her family safe, the monsters dead, peace restored. Why did war still live in her heart? Behind her, the Christmas tree blinked, casting living shadows that danced over the walls. The darkness pressed patiently against the windows, waiting for its chance to seep back in. It always found a way. The apartment was warm and bright, filled with love and safety and all the things worth protecting. But Deborah knew that light could only push darkness back so far. There would always be basements and alleys and abandoned warehouses where darkness crept and terrible things happened. The thought should have troubled her. Instead, it felt like coming home.
Thank you for sharing my nightmares and helping me carry the grief. If this episode left a mark, do me a favor. Pass it along to someone who deserves to lose a little sleep. Subscribe, leave a comment, tell me what's keeping you up. You can support the show on Patreon for early episodes and a look at what goes into building these nightmares. My books are on Amazon. Links are below. Thank you for sharing this time with me. Good night.